Hello denizens of the Empire, it's Jabari here. Thanks for tuning in to the next installment of the series of videos where I simply share my thoughts and opinions on certain subject matters regarding African history, with my brain being the only cited source for the content. During a period spanning roughly between the years of 1500 and 1900, Europeans obsessively took control of everything they could get their hands on. Virtually all of the largest and most powerful civilizations of the New World fell into the hands of Europeans relatively early on during this period, with the remainder being slowly conquered in the following centuries. Asia and Africa fared much better, as their relative immunity to European diseases as well as their possession of horses and Iron Age technology proved too difficult for early European conquerors to handle. However, in the 19th century, between a combination of technological leaps and divide and conquer strategies, European powers were able to effectively take control of nearly the whole of Africa and most of Asia, with the former faring much worse than the latter. So, why was Africa affected so much worse than other places that were colonized by Europeans? So firstly, before we fully dissect my thoughts on this topic, I think it's important to compare and contrast the parallels between the Americas and Africa. Both faced mass-scale colonization by Europeans, and to present day, the countries within both Africa and the Americas alike have official languages that derive from foreign lands. Most countries of North and South America are inhabited by English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese speakers, while most African countries speak Arabic, English, French, or German, among others. Despite this, the case in Africa differs significantly from the situation in the Americas. Firstly, there was a wider variety of European languages introduced into Africa collectively, as the colonization process effectively sliced Africa into several much smaller borders than what was the case in the colonization of the Americas, with both continents combined still having less total countries than Africa. Secondly, Africans still primarily speak indigenous languages in their day-to-day lives, while only speaking European languages for business, school, or official purposes. The inhabitants of the countries of the Americas, on the other hand, are primarily native speakers of European languages, with only a small percentage still retaining their indigenous languages. There is not a single country in the Americas where the majority of its inhabitants still speak an indigenous language. Lastly, the majority of Africa's population is still composed of indigenous African people, whereas most Native Americans have either died off from Old World diseases or mixed with European conquerors and African slaves, forming entirely new national identities and ethnic groups, Mexicans being a prominent example. North America's indigenous populations only make up a small fraction of its total population, with the majority of its inhabitants being of European descent and speakers of European languages. The borders also effectively united more peoples into polities larger than anything ever seen in pre-Columbian America. South America, on the other hand, still retains a relatively large population of native people or ones containing heavy European or African admixture, and it also contains several breakaway countries that were formerly part of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. With that being said, North America is almost primarily just an offshoot of a European country now in terms of ethnic makeup and ways of life, while South America is a mixture of the indigenous populations, African peoples, and European peoples. Africa virtually remained the same as far as population, but the European presence within the continent left its mark on these populations in several other ways. So with all comparisons between African colonization and New World colonization out in the open, why do African countries fare so much worse comparatively speaking? Why are the United States and Canada world powers while Nigeria and South Africa still struggle to be anywhere close? Well, here are a few reasons why I think that's the case. Firstly, the peoples of Africa are more scattered and disunified into countries with unnatural borders. In comparison to Asia and the Americas, Africa is plagued with an immense amount of ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity. And by plagued, I mean it's much easier to unify a people who have a shared culture and history. The more diversity, the more potential for conflict. Prior to European arrival, Leaders seem to have been well aware of this, and as a result, many African states tended to govern conquered peoples in a manner that allowed them to retain relative autonomy, as well as retention of their own indigenous languages and ways of life, so as long as they paid their taxes and supplied troops when needed. However, this all changed when Europeans arrived, as Europeans historically forced those conquered to speak their languages and abandon any religions, cultural practices, or administrative practices that didn't conform to their own. With that being said, contrary to Europe, Africa retained immense ethnic diversity, languages, states, and kingdoms throughout the majority of its history, and the idea of one large unified empire of people who all spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods was a very rare concept. Once Europeans arrived, they brought this new form of society into Africa with complete disregard to all of its ethno-linguistic diversity or pre-existing borders, ones that had never existed at any point in Africa's history, and largely did not conform with the rivers, mountains, deserts, or ethnic groups, as was the case with most states of the past. When the states of Asia were colonized by Europe, the local borders remained relatively intact with a few small exceptions in some cases. Later conflicts in the post-colonial era even split homogeneous nations into even smaller ones, such as the case with the Korean Peninsula. But anyway, moving back, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 saw the meeting of several European nations that wanted to carve up lands of Africa and divide them amongst one another, the majority of which no European had ever set foot in. As mentioned before, this was done without regard for pre-existing borders or societies and without the knowledge or consent of African rulers. As a result, these new borders would often unite enemy states with one another, separate entire ethnic groups, and even unite people with entirely different political structures and ways of life. For example, hunter-gatherers with farmers or Muslims with traditional religious practitioners. Naturally, this led to lots of conflict as many of these opposing states clashed with one another before and after independence. Sometimes these clashes were created partially or entirely by European influence, such as the Rwanda genocide, in which British authorities systematically created conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi people, which led to one of the most brutal human atrocities in the modern era. So, another major reason I'd like to discuss is economic disruption. When Europeans first began exploring the coasts of the African continent in the 15th century, they found themselves immersed into complex societies with well-established trade routes, economies, and wealth distributions that had prevailed for millennia. The Trans-Saharan trade network of West Africa controlled the majority of the Old World's gold for centuries. The Swahili coast of East Africa was part of the Indian Ocean trade network, which was basically the Silk Road of the sea. Commodities like silk, porcelain, and spices were traded to Africa for ivory, gold, and tortoiseshells, among many other goods. However, during the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese explorers sought to control these lucrative trade routes. West Africans proved to be too resilient to be overcome by early Europeans for several centuries, since the region was full of many large kingdoms and empires that were more than capable of defending their borders, all the while imposing taxes even on all outsiders, Europeans included. However, the small city-states of the Swahili coast fared much worse since their trade and commerce were historically conducted on a primarily peaceful basis. The Portuguese swiftly brought most of them under their control by bringing cannon fire upon any and all who resisted. While most regions of Africa retained their autonomy for centuries to come, economic disruption still did its number on African polities. European goods such as muskets completely reshaped the economies of West Africa, effectively making the states much more powerful than their interior counterparts, and slaves becoming the primary commodity sought by European merchants. And a vicious cycle of brutality and bloodshed would continue. It is important to note that prior to this, the most powerful kingdoms relied on complex overland trade networks. This shift of power to the coast was something unseen before in African history. And then there is corruption, which is by far one of the most influential reasons why post-colonial Africa remains in such a rough state compared to other post-colonial nations. Corruption exists in every nation and has so since the earliest civilizations were founded thousands of years ago, and it may very well continue indefinitely into the future. However, when Europeans began trading with Africans, the capacity of cruelty and greed among African civilization was truly tested. Some African rulers like Tipu Tip of Central Africa carved out entire empires from the ground up that were almost entirely and unapologetically based on the capture and sale of other human beings. Leaders would sometimes go to war with the sole purpose of taking slaves for trade with their European trade partners. Once Europeans began the taking of African states themselves, they'd often find an obedient native puppet ruler to govern the people on their behalf, and replace any that don't agree to their terms. This strategy was effective as the conquered peoples were less likely to rebel against one of their own than the white man. Unfortunately, these puppet rulers typically had their own self-interests and agendas in mind, which lined up with their colonial overlords from Europe as much as possible to ensure their own prosperity and wealth. Most of the time, this involved utilizing the local people as a cheap force of labor for the extraction of resources and subsequent exportation to Europe. This same strategy continues to present day, with many leaders of African nations carrying on the torch of corruption and continuously underpaying local labor forces to generate as much revenue as possible from their nation's raw materials. Revenue that only guarantees the success of a rich minority while the majority remain poor and impoverished, and their states and countries remaining largely without proper infrastructure, healthcare access, or education systems. The last reason I like to touch on that really sealed the deal for the unfortunate fate of African nations is just a general racist attitude towards Africans. For centuries, Africa prior to the colonial era was looked upon as nothing more than a land of free labor by Europeans, an expansive landmass that supplied a constant flow of farmers to tend to the crops that were being planted in their New World colonies. Farmers that had no rights, no privileges, and were considered property in the same sense as cattle or horses. As this trend continued over the centuries, European slave masters' attitudes conformed to this point of view, even more as black people were looked upon as inferior to all races of man. Initially, this mentality developed from the practice of slavery, which almost exclusively involved the sale and ownership of black slaves from Africa. However, as centuries went by, everything from their biology to their religions and their ways of life were viewed as less developed or inferior versions of what other human beings were capable of achieving. This mentality ran so deep that it was taught in accredited education systems and what is dubbed today as scientific racism. Perhaps the most powerful tool of this was known as the white man's burden, a strong and pretentious belief that white men had the so-called burden of civilizing all other non-white races of the world, bringing them civilization, education, and of course, the word of God. Additionally, they looked upon their mistreatment of indigenous peoples as a justified practice, or basically a harsh trade-off in exchange for bringing the white man's way of life into their savage societies. So that pretty much concludes the video. Bear in mind that these are all just opinions. You're welcome to agree or disagree or simply share your thoughts in the comment section. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. For sources, check out my website, linked below. If you'd like to support future projects, you can do so there as well, or by clicking the join button below, or by becoming a patron. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as usual, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.